Infelizmente, chegamos à última apresentação desse nosso seminário. É com grande prazer que eu vou chamar para a palestra, cujo tema é Vidas Paralelas, Liberdade e Poder, o nosso grande ídolo, inspirador, o legendário fundador do Mises Institute, Lew Rockwell.
Elio, how great it is to be here. What an honor it is to be here. I didn't have a chance to go to the first Austrian seminar in the United States in 1974 in Vermont, but I feel like I'm at the Brazilian equivalent, so it's a great moment. I'm going to talk about two economists who lived parallel lives and pursued two different and contrary goals. One was devoted to liberty, one was devoted to the state. The first remained a teacher for his entire life, never in any prestige institution, never exercising any power. Indeed, he used his post teaching against the exercise of power and became the world's most powerful intellectual voice for radical liberalism or libertarianism. This man who loved liberty died in 1995, and his work has taken flight the world over. His books are selling as never before, all of them, and his star is rising by the day. His name is Muriel Rothbard. The second one became the most powerful and influential economist in the world, practically running the world for a long time. While he was in power, he was revered by anyone who was anyone. His every utterance could cause billions to be made or lost in the market. But he will live out the rest of his days under a cloud of derision and discredit, defending himself against the perception that he created history's largest financial calamity. His name is Alan Greenspan. Let us track these two lives and consider the choices these men made. As Charles Burris has pointed out, they were both born in New York City in 1926. Rothbard was born on Tuesday, March 2nd. The following Saturday, March 6th, Alan Greenspan was born. They had a not unsimilar background and upbringing. Greenspan of German Jewish heritage, Rothbard of Russian Jewish heritage. Both attended private schools and pursued their respective passions. It is after high school that their lives diverged. Whereas Rothbard followed a very mainstream path in academic economics, one that would seem to clear the way for him as a giant in the profession. Greenspan went to the Juilliard School of Music to pursue his true love, the clarinet. As remarkable as it may seem today, Greenspan was not interested in economics, at least initially. I mention this because it is an implausible beginning for the man who would later take the helm of the institution that would purport to manage the world reserve currency, and a man after whom a professorship at New York University has been named and who has received so many other honors. Meanwhile, Rothbard decided to attend Columbia University. He was not at first an economics major. His passion was mathematics. And this was even before the full mathematicization of the profession. At Columbia, he studied under the famed statistician Harold Hotelling. It might have been Hotelling who led Rothbard to economic studies, but very early on, Rothbard, the mathematician, could see what was wrong with the application of statistical methods to economic theory. He would later build on Mises to construct a systematic theory of economics rooted in logical deduction in the manner of the 19th century theorists. All the while, his libertarianism was also in strong formation from very early in his youth. As implausible as it may seem today, Rothbard's biography would seem to be exactly what made for professional triumph in the mainstream of opinion and with the powers that be. What made that impossible were the choices he made, choices made on principle and for the love of truth and liberty. Unlike Rothbard, Greenspan's grades were only average, and he departed to perform with the Harry Jerome Orchestra, playing saxophone or clarinet as necessary. He traveled the country on buses between engagements, but understandably he tired of that life, and in 1945 changed his school and his major to economics. School was New York University, where Mises had begun teaching that very year. But Greenspan did not study with Mises, whom he might have regarded as a washed-up old man who could do nothing for his primary concern, which was his career. Instead, he chose the NYU division called the Factory, 9,000 students competing in various fields of specialization in business. He graduated with honors in 1945 and enrolled in the master's program, graduating in 1948. At this point, the lives of Rothbard and Greenspan briefly intersect in an interesting way at Columbia University. 2 years earlier, Rothbard had received his own master's and had enrolled in the PhD program. Professor Arthur Burns was the most prominent faculty member. Burns would later become Eisenhower's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and Nixon's chairman of the Federal Reserve. One might say he was the Greenspan of his day. Greenspan dropped out of the Columbia economics program to follow Burns to Washington, a model for a life of chasing powerful positions and powerful people. Greenspan watched Burns carefully, impressed at how economics in an age of positivism could be used in the service of state-connected careers. Rothbard, meanwhile, stayed behind at Columbia, writing and studying. One of his seminal articles in this period was published in a book in honor of Mises, that supposedly washed-up old man who just so happened to have a penchant for speaking truth to power. Just as Burns became Greenspan's model, Mises had become Rothbard's model. Two more opposing career paths could hardly be imagined. Mises had been tossed out of 2 countries for his principled stance and forfeited prestigious positions in the profession because he was unwilling to go along with historicism and Keynesianism. Rothbard would follow a similar path. His article, written in honor of Mises, published in 1956, was a reconstruction of utility and welfare economics upon non-mathematical lines. Here we have the graduate student doing what a principled scholar does, pursuing truth through research and writing. He might have chosen to echo the rising Keynesianism and positivism of his day. Certainly he was intellectually capable of becoming a famous master of both fields. Instead, he rejected them intellectually and took a different path along the lines laid out by Mises. And what was Greenspan doing? He was running around Washington, pandering to the big shots, watching their every move, striving to be like them, and attempting to follow in their footsteps by cultivating press contacts and relationships to people in high places. Rothbard received his PhD in 1956, but only after jumping over 1,000 barriers that had been put in his path by none other than Greenspan's own mentor. There were times when Arthur Burns's recalcitrance drove Murray to despair. He felt he could not comply with Burns's dictates, that he could not please Burns, and that Burns seemed to be sabotaging his work. Burns was not his dissertation advisor, was not even on his committee, but such was his power in the department that he could interfere. Ironically, Burns had known Rothbard since his childhood. They had lived for a number of years in the same apartment building. There could be no question that this was a personal attack against Murray. Only when Burns moved away and became so wrapped up in Washington politics that he no longer cared was Rothbard finally able to win out, and his PhD was awarded in 1956. Now let me make a few comments about Rothbard's dissertation. It was an empirical account of America's first serious business cycle, the U.S.'s first serious business cycle, I should say, the Panic of 1819. He scoured every source he could find, producing many pages of detailed economic data. He also knew the importance of ideology and personality in the history of economics, so he recounted the debates over the policy response. Then as now, people urged intervention. But unlike today, the government did not respond to the demands for inflation, price supports, bailouts and fiscal stimulus. As a result, the panic ended and the economy recovered very quickly. What was the fate of this dissertation? For more than 50 years, it has been the standard reference on this episode. It was printed and reprinted many times, cited many times. Today, the Mises Institute has an edition, and it continues to sell on a large scale. Let me hop ahead to Greenspan's dissertation, which wasn't filed with New York University until more than 2 decades later in 1977. It was quickly sealed and continues to be unavailable to anyone. No one had any idea of what it contained until last year, when a single copy was leaked to a reporter for Barron's. What it contained was so irrelevant that it barely made the news. It was a collection of reports he had written for various purposes over the previous 20 years. A PhD granted for life experience, we might say. What did Greenspan do in the intervening years? He founded a consulting company, Townsend Greenspan, and worked for the National Industrial Conference Board. To understand Greenspan's firm and what it did, it's important to understand the role of the economic expert in an age of positivism. In the post-war period, the scientists with the Gnostic-style knowledge and shadowy connections to power ascended to massive public fame. The substance itself didn't matter so much as the illusion of expertise. What his firm sold was Greenspan to such powerful clients as J.P. Morgan and Company. Greenspan carefully crafted his image as an omniscient pundit on all matters related to economics. He used his connections to Burns and rising connections to all related power elites to build up a reputation as a monk-like data collector, poring over charts, coming up with printable comments and predictions. It was mostly illusion. There were no charts and data collections and machines to make perfect predictions. What Greenspan did was to commodify his own pandering ways and sell them to a culture hungry for illusions. All throughout the 60s and the decades following, he worked to craft his persona so as to fit perfectly with the prevailing ethos. That ethos was statism, the glorification of central management by the experts. Greenspan sought to be on the top of the heap. Let me say a few words about Greenspan's connections to Ayn Rand. The press routinely misunderstands the meaning of this relationship. The only writer who I think has gotten it right, aside from people in the inner circle like George Reisman, Nathaniel Branden, or Murray Rothbard, is Frederick Sheehan, author of Panderer to Power. Sheehan points out that Greenspan's relationship to Rand was always opportunistic and never had any effect on Greenspan's life. She was a famous author on the rise. Greenspan was the master of hitching his wagon to any horse on the move. Rand herself called him the Undertaker. She would frequently ask her associates, "Do you think Alan might basically be a social climber?" Her intuition, of course, was correct. But what the Rand episode illustrates is also terribly unflattering for Greenspan in another way. It is bad enough to be a person who cravenly seeks power while remaining in ignorance. But as Greenspan revealed in his 1965 article called Gold and Economic Freedom, written for Rand, he actually knew the truth. He knew that the Fed creates business cycles. He wrote this in his article, even getting the story of the Great Depression right. He knew that fiat money builds the state. He said that the gold standard is the only monetary guarantor of freedom. It's bad enough when a person devotes his life to the service of power, when he does it in a state of intellectual ignorance. But when the same person pursues a path in a state of published knowledge, it seems to me even more reprehensible. Thus, his relationship to Rand was no different from his relationship to anyone else. He used her as a stepping stone towards his real goal. I should add another parallel. Rothbard, of course, was also a member of the Rand Circle, though expelled when he refused to demand to convert his wife to atheism or divorce her. It was only a few years following the Gold article, that Greenspan angled his way into the Nixon campaign of 1968, taking the job of coordinator of economic policy research. He began a shuttle back and forth between New York City and Washington that would define the rest of his life. In 1970, his mentor Burns was sworn in as the head of the Fed, and here is where Greenspan set his sights on that position as his lifetime goal. Every choice he made after this point was dedicated to that. All the while, he maintained his high public profile, making as many as 80 speeches a year and pulling in huge consulting fees, while otherwise pretending to live a monk-like existence, studying charts and tables and doling out bits of advice and wisdom for high dollars. Despite the personality cult he was building, his predictions were almost always wrong. Let me give only the most famous example. On January 7th, 1973, the New York Times featured his picture with a spread on brilliant market forecasters. He was quoted as follows: "It's very rare that you can be as unqualifiedly bullish as you can now." 4 days later, the market peaked and bottomed out 46% lower 1 year later. This was typical for him, somehow able to build a reputation as a prophet while being wrong. His method was always the same, using high-flown rhetoric and obscure language while dissembling and faking. It was a perfect method for government work. And so that same year, he became head of the Council of Economic Advisors for Richard Nixon. In 1974, he urged President Ford to propose a new tax as a means of combating inflation. He was involved in the Whip Inflation Now campaign, complete with its win buttons, though he knew full well that the real culprit was not a lack of morale in the population, but a Fed that would not stop the printing press. A few years later, he winnowed his way into the Reagan inner circle and became head of the Social Security Commission. He urged dramatically increased payroll taxes, perhaps the reason he was appointed and they were imposed. All of this was mere prelude to 1987, when the goal of his career was at hand. He was nominated for the position he'd been training for almost his whole life, head of the Fed. What happened soon afterwards was the famous stock market crash of 1987. Here he did what he would do again and again during his 20-year tenure. He opened up the monetary spigots. He did it again and again. Monetary pumping was his one weapon. To take just some of the examples of the Mexican debt crisis of 1996, the so-called Asian contagion of 1997, long-term capital management in 1998, the Y2K crisis of 1999 and 2000, the dot-com collapse, and finally the 9/11 terrorist incidents in Washington and New York. Oh, and never forget that Greenspan on November 13th, 2001 was awarded the Enron Prize. Essentially, he proved himself adept at serving the state whenever it needed help. Politicians use Greenspan as what Sheehan calls their air raid shelter. He did them a favor, and they returned it by appointing him again and again. And they fawned over him as few have been fawned over. And it's no wonder he was history's biggest counterfeiter. You can see the map of this in the federal funds rate. Looking at the chart from the 60s to the present, we see a huge arch with a peak in 1979 and the rate trending steadily downward to the present level of 0. The only way this could be justified would be through large increases in savings and capital. We've not seen this. The picture of lower and lower rates is wholly artificial, and of course it's also bubble-inducing in the extreme. What we are experiencing now in the U.S. and elsewhere is a direct result of Greenspan's tenure, which led to the greatest financial catastrophe in modern times. And make no mistake, every bit of it can be blamed on Alan Greenspan. We know from the on-record reports of everyone who has worked with him that he ruled the Federal Open Market Committee meetings with an iron fist, never seeking anyone else's opinion, nor tolerating dissent to his political intuitions. He would beat back any contrary views with withering stares and implicit and explicit rebukes. It was ruled by fear and intimidation thanks to his political connections. He could make or break people. He also continued to cultivate his public image as a way of crushing disagreements within the Fed. The message he sent through his high status was, "Don't you dare disagree with this God on earth whom all people adore." For a time we had the entire Wall Street and Washington establishment singing one long united chorus of the hymn, "Thank God for Greenspan." He encouraged this, sending his minions out to tell the press that he deserved credit for all good things: an uptick in employment, a downtick in the trade deficit, an optimistic earnings report from Wall Street. No matter what the news, he would take credit for it. Those were crazy times. An article appeared in the New Republic magazine that told of a cult on Wall Street involving candles, incense, and iconic Buddha-like images of Greenspan in the back rooms of big firms. The story was preposterous, like so much in the New Republic, but believable. It took some time before anyone figured out that it was fake. I don't need to tell you how the story of Greenspan ends. His world came crashing down around him. He spends his time today trying to explain his way out of the blame. Much to his everlasting disgrace, he has intimated on many occasions that the meltdown was not his fault, nor a failure, of course, of the government, but a result of inherent flaws in the market. Ayn Rand speculated that this undertaker might just be a social climber. She did not and could not have known that he would eventually climb his way all the way to the top, fall all the way to the bottom, and while writhing in shame, would betray the entire cause to which he pretended devotion. But anyone who looked at his life could see the pattern. It was not a complex one. He served the state. As Rothbard himself wrote, quote, "Greenspan's real qualification is that he can be trusted never to rock the establishment's boat." Indeed, he served the establishment from the first day to the last. Now I'd like to turn back to Rothbard and his life. When we last left him, he had just completed his dissertation. He was about to embark on a great journey that would consume his entire life. He published in the established journals as long as he could, but at some point his quest for truth and love of liberty meant he would be cut off from them. Despite his brilliance and his credentials, he did not get a prestigious university post. He worked for a private academic foundation, reviewing all the latest books on U.S. history, philosophy, law, and economics. His massive treatise on economics that appeared in 1963 began as a tutorial written on behalf of that foundation. When he did get a position, it was at Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute. It was not in an economics department, but rather, as Joe Salerno pointed out, in the Department of Social Sciences. There was one other economist on the faculty, a communist. He had a dumpy office, he had a bad salary, and mostly uninterested students who were all engineering majors. But it hardly mattered to him. He had the freedom to write and publish and tell the truth, and that's what he wanted more than anything. And yet even here his options were limited. As a brilliant supporter of the free market, one might think that conservative journals of opinion would be open to him. But soon after the Cold War intensified, he could not be quiet on an issue of vast importance to him, namely the relationship between liberty and military expansionism. He saw the warfare state as nothing but a species of socialism, and he adhered to the credo of the old classical liberals, a free market plus an international outlook of peace. For this, he was excommunicated by the conservatives. The result was that he ended up building his own global movement, and one that began in his living room. His 24 books and literally thousands of articles ended up inspiring a vast worldwide movement for liberty. His economic writings bridged the gap between Mises and the current generation of Austrians and added mightily to the edifice. His wonderful personality demonstrated to one and all that it is possible to have fun while fighting Leviathan. As for Rothbard's own character, the contrast with Greenspan could not be starker. If Greenspan was the dreary undertaker, Rothbard was the happy warrior. Rothbard thrilled to spend time with students, faculty, anyone interested in liberty and Austrian economics. When you spoke to him, he was glad to talk about the field of interest that was the other person's specialization, whether it was history, philosophy, ethics, politics, Baroque church architecture, religion, music, sports, or even the soaps on TV. He always made others feel important. He was always excited to give credit to others and draw attention to the contribution of everyone to the great cause. He never held a grudge for long. Even for those who betrayed him personally, there was always an opportunity for reconciliation. All of these traits derive from his amazing generosity of spirit, to which I attribute his love of truth above all else. His too short life was cut off in 1995. But that was also the year that the web browser became common in offices and homes. Those classes that Rothbard taught in his small New York classroom and later at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas are now being broadcast around the world through iTunes and Mises.org. His books are all in print and selling as never before. There are not only his books, but books on his books and an entire literature growing up around his legacy. Some have said that Rothbard was his own worst enemy. People said the same of Mises. The idea here is that they could have helped their career by going along to get along. And of course that's true enough. But is going along all we really want out of life? Or do we want to make a difference in a way that will outlast us? At some point in our lives, we will all come to the realization that all the money and all the power we can accumulate will be useless after we die. The legacy we will leave on this earth comes down to the principles by which we lived. It is the ideas we hold and the way we pursued them that is the source of our immortality. Greenspan will leave an economy in shambles and a lifetime of pandering. Rothbard left a grand vision of liberty united with science and an example of what it means to truly think long term. In all ages and in all times, people must make a choice. Will we accept the world as it is and try to fit in, getting as much as we can from the system until we bow out? Or will we stick to principle, pay the price that involves, and leave the world a better place? I submit to you that anyone who has ever truly loved liberty has chosen the second course. This is the course that the two Mises Institutes are dedicated to following. May we all individually make that same decision. Thank you.